I'm probably quite unusual as a skeptic insofar as I'm probably one of the few skeptics that actually argue that parapsychology, at its best, is a genuine science. A lot of skeptics would argue that it's a pseudoscience, that it has the trappings of science, but you dig a little bit deeper and you realise, no, it's not really a proper science at all. And for a long time, when I first discovered the joys of skepticism, that was a position that I adopted as well. I even taught that in my lectures. But the more I got to know parapsychologists and appreciated their level of understanding of what they were doing and realised that they weren't all incompetent nincompoops. They actually knew what they were doing, and often their understanding of the scientific method and their implementation of the scientific method was often ahead of what you might see in psychology or some other sciences. And so gradually I did actually change my mind. Basically, science is a method. That's all it is. It's a method of trying to ask questions about the way the world works. And provided that you are applying the method appropriately, then you are doing science. There are some skeptics who can't believe that it could even be possible for things like telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition to exist. And therefore, there's a tendency to adopt a position that if any results from studies seem to suggest support for those things, well, there must be something wrong with them. Now, you can look at any area of science and point to examples of sloppiness and bad practice and so on and so forth, and that very much includes psychology. But if you only focus on that stuff, then you may well end up dismissing a whole area as being a pseudoscience. But I don't think that's fair. You should focus on best practice within a particular discipline, and that's what you base your answer on. And as I say, I've gradually come around to realise that that is the case. Now, having said that, well, yeah, my position ends up being kind of somewhat unusual insofar as I am still not convinced that paranormal forces actually do exist, but I think you can still investigate that issue scientifically. The other point I would make is that at various times, skeptics such as myself and Susan Blackmore, Richard Wiseman, James Randi, various others have directly tested paranormal claims. Well, if you're doing that and you're doing it scientifically, you're doing parapsychology. So I really don't see how you can argue legitimately that parapsychology at its best is not a science. Over the years, I have had lots of project students who are big fans of Rupert Sheldrake, and they've wanted to base their projects on his claims, and I've always been quite open to that. I can honestly say that none of them have ever managed to replicate the effects that Rupert reports. I think there are lots of possible factors there. Now, some people, particularly parapsychologists, would argue that if it's a skeptic that's doing the experiment, that somehow inhibits the paranormal effects. Logically, it's a possibility, but if that's the case, well, I'm doomed to never actually witness these effects with my own eyes. The thing with the situation I'm talking about is that typically it wasn't me that was running the experiments, it was my students. And they were strong believers. They were convinced that they were going to get these effects, but they still didn't. The most extensive attempt that I had in terms of a collaboration with Rupert was with respect to a telephone telepathy study. Rupert believes that some people are able to tell who is calling them on the phone before they pick the phone up. And he's published a lot of research that appears to support that. But each of those individual studies, you can pick out methodological issues. Not to say that that means that the results aren't valid, but it means we can't be sure the results are valid. And so what we wanted to do was to set up a really totally rigorous experiment where we controlled for all of those methodological problems. And this was done in collaboration with a couple of very good project students working together. It was incredibly labour intensive because what we had to have, you have to have obviously the receiver, the person who is trying to guess before they pick up the phone who is on the phone. You have to have a group of senders, 4 possible senders, one of which will be randomly selected on each trial. We wanted to film what was happening at both ends. So we had to have people doing the filming. We had to kind of try and coordinate all that. We had 2 different locations, and a huge amount of work went into it. I think we'd originally intended, I think our target was 200 trials. We managed to get 100 trials and pretty much ran out of steam. The project students' deadlines came up. I have to say, if memory serves, and I would have to check this, but if memory serves, the results were coming out pretty much on chance, what you'd expect by chance. So it would have been a bit weird if we'd finished the study and suddenly there'd been a big increase in hits in the second half. That would have been odd. So I think it's never been published. We never wrote it up, and so people can just make of it what they will. But to my own mind personally, I thought there was no point in there's certainly no way that we were going to get significant results out of it, and in the end we didn't finish that study off, despite the huge amount of work that had gone into it. Results coming from people like Stefan Schmidt, who has been kind of somewhat critical of the telephone telepathy studies in the past, and is now kind of saying that at least some people seem to be able to do this, even if it's not a general ability. That is really intriguing. And, I think it would be a mistake to draw any strong conclusions from just a few studies, a few positive studies. We know that from the history of science. We can look back at episodes in the past, the discovery of N-rays, there's a whole host, cold fusion. There's a lot of situations where you will get papers being published which apparently have gone through the full refereeing process and produced surprising results, and other people have claimed to replicate. But after a while, it becomes apparent that actually no, that whatever caused that initial spur of excitement, there doesn't really seem to be anything in it after all. Now, it's always difficult. I mean, I find those kind of results intriguing, and I would want to see people carrying on doing research. One of the things that really surprises me about telephone telepathy is that more parapsychologists haven't tried to replicate it. Because although it can be logistically quite demanding, it's actually a relatively simple, straightforward method. And given that a lot of the other stuff that parapsychologists do is very labour intensive, like Ganzfeld studies and all this kind of thing, or the dream telepathy, those are all very labour intensive as well. I am surprised that we don't have more parapsychologists saying, well, this sounds intriguing, it's relatively straightforward, let's see if we can all demonstrate it. Because if there was a whole massive data coming from lots of different laboratories and so on, then at least I think some fair-minded skeptics would kind of take it more seriously. I think it should be taken seriously. I think these challenges to skeptics should be taken seriously and not just dismissed on the grounds that, oh, well, we know it's impossible, so therefore we don't need to look at the results. But as I say, I'd hold fire on drawing any strong conclusions given the current state of the evidence. If those kind of results could be replicated, across a lot of different laboratories by independent investigators, including preferably some who were of a sceptical disposition, then I think one would have to consider the possibility of direct mind-to-mind communication. I can't think of any other obvious explanations. I mean, obviously, you would want to try and make sure you've ruled out any possibility of a normal explanation. But if you get to that point, then yeah, you'd have to consider that seriously. I have increasingly begun to wonder whether, given that all science is about trying to separate the signal from the noise, then what would a science look like if in fact you had nothing but noise? Because we would occasionally think we've seen signals there. No matter how hard we try to be as rigorous as we can and to avoid our own biases and so on and so forth, you'll get statistical blips, you'll get methodological issues that maybe no one's thought of, and so on and so forth. And so, even if that is the case, as I said, I think of parapsychology as being a real science. Maybe one of its values is it really is kind of demonstrating how science operates at the limits, and maybe ultimately there are no real signals there. Well, what that will mean is, in my personal opinion, that parapsychology will just kind of carry on forever because there'll always be enough people around to think, well, yeah, there might be something. And logically, skeptics can never prove that paranormal forces don't exist. We may just not have looked in the right place yet or done it properly. When it comes to ideas which contradict, if you like, common sense, well, yeah, we all know that modern physics is full of ideas that contradict common sense, and parapsychologists in particular tend to latch on to whatever the latest ideas are in physics to try and justify, well, that's weird, so that maybe explains this weird thing like telepathy or precognition and so on. Well, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I don't know. I'm not a physicist. I can't comment on that. But I do know that it has always been the pattern throughout the history of parapsychology. And I don't think it's enough just to say, oh, quantum entanglement. I don't think that's not an explanation. It's you need to kind of flesh that model out if you think it's a genuine explanation. Say, what are the implications of it? How can we test that particular model of what's going on? So, there are physicists like Julia Mossbridge, like various other people within the field who believe that physics can provide some explanations for some of these weird effects that parapsychologists report. The vast majority of physicists don't buy into those ideas. There's very much a minority view. The idea is often put forward by near-death experience researchers that what their argument is, they say, how can it be that people can have these rich cognitive experiences when they're flatlining? That's how it's often presented. Now, there's a number of issues with that way of phrasing it. One is, we don't know when the experience is actually taking place. It could be as they're rapidly going into a state of unconsciousness, it could be as they're more slowly coming out of it. We don't actually know. Also, and most of the time, of course, people don't have electrodes stuck on their scalp while they're having a near-death experience. So, it's all very speculative. But even if they did, we know that, first of all, there can be a lot of activity at deeper brain structures, even if you are recording a flat EEG from the surface of the scalp. And that some of that activity can actually lead to, can be correlated with hallucinatory experiences. And as interestingly, more recent research has shown that even quite a long time after the heart has stopped beating, you can often get a situation, this has been shown both in humans and in rats, where there'll be a burst of very, very high level activity in the brain that can go on for anything between 30 seconds and 3 minutes. So maybe that's where the near-death experience is occurring. And basically, we just don't know. There are some claims made of particular one of the kind of classic cases that's put forward to try and demonstrate that consciousness somehow does leave the body, when people are in this state, is the Pam Reynolds case. And it is a fascinating case, no question about it. She essentially had the kind of blood drained from her body for this particular operation that had to be carried out. And when she came to again in the recovery room, she reported she'd had a vivid near-death experience, a lot of the kind of classical stuff that people have during these experiences. If you actually look at the time frame of that, if you actually plot the time, you realise she had that experience very early on, before the blood was drained from her body. And there are lots of possible explanations for what's going on when people have these experiences. But one very important factor is that we know that people do sometimes recover consciousness while they're under the anaesthetic. So they can't move, they can't speak, they can't say anything, but senses can return. The first sense that would return is hearing, and it'd be very natural when you're in that state to visualise what might be going on around you on the basis of the sounds that you can hear. And so the whole kind of psychology of out-of-body experiences is relevant here. And basically, if you kind of think about it in those terms, plus a lot of other factors of what might be going on, we all have some idea of what operating rooms look like, what goes on in them. We're not always going to be accurate, but we've got some idea. So you've got that, you've got kind of lucky guesses, you've got kind of possibility that reports of what happened might change as people, to make it more coherent with what we now know did happen, and so on and so forth. So all of those kind of factors do come into play. Now, the alternative to the idea that consciousness is genuinely leaving the body is that it's a very, very rich hallucinatory experience. And I think there's kind of some quite good arguments for that, not least the fact that there are lots of cases where what people report doesn't correspond to what was actually going on. There are many kind of reports that suggest that sometimes when people are having their near-death experience, they can pick up and accurately report on activities that are taking place in a different room, even down to the level of describing what people were wearing, what they said to each other, and so on. Now, I'm not generally convinced, because often when you dig deeper, you find that those cases are not as impressive as they're presented. Maybe we'll get to a point where we actually understand it, but I think we're far from it yet. And so it's more a question of saying, well, potentially, parapsychology could provide evidence, any kind of evidence of the mind separated from the body, whether it be during an out-of-body experience or any kind of evidence of post-mortem survival, would be very strong evidence in favour of some kind of dualistic approach to the nature of consciousness. But I'm not convinced yet that the evidence is strong enough to support that. Maybe that will be where the answer is found ultimately, but as I say, I don't think we're there yet. I still think that the evidence that's put forward can be explained within what we know about conventional neuroscience, which would basically be that consciousness is entirely dependent upon the neuronal substructure and cannot be separated from it. But I could be wrong. It may turn out that the kind of standard conventional neuroscientific approach to these issues is mistaken, and that we need to have a kind of more expanded notions of what the mind is and what consciousness is and so on. But I don't think we're at a point yet where we are really forced to have those kind of models. And basically, science is all about different approaches, trying to see which is the best in terms of explaining the data that's available. At the moment, I'm kind of still basically happy with the notion that standard neuroscience can account for the data that we have so far. Well, I think we need to make a big distinction between the kind of day-to-day activities of mediums and controlled tests of mediums. So in terms of the day-to-day activities of mediums, I mean, we've tested mediums and psychics over the years, never produced any evidence supporting the notion that they really can do what they sincerely think they can do. I mean, let's make another distinction between the deliberate fakes and those who genuinely believe that they have a gift. And in my opinion, based on purely my own personal impressions, I think the vast majority of people who claim to have this gift genuinely do believe that they have. But there are deliberate fakes out there. The ones who, certainly that we've tested, I think they all genuinely believe that they have a gift. The readings are typically not that impressive, whereas there is a technique known as cold reading, which can be used by deliberate con artists to produce very impressive readings. And it's a set of techniques, really. It involves a lot of different aspects. One part of it is something called the Barnum effect. There are certain kinds of statements that sound as if they're saying something very profound and insightful about your innermost personality, but actually apply to everybody. So if you were doing a reading just on the basis of Barnum statements, which wouldn't be very wise, you're best to use other techniques as well. But if you were, you might say something like, I'm sensing that you've got a lot of unused potential. You've achieved a lot in life, but there's so much more you could achieve if you could just tap into that potential. You've got a better than average sense of humour. And of course everybody thinks they've got a better than average sense of humour, because if other people don't laugh at what you think is funny, they're the ones with the problem, not you. And a skilled cold reader, I've watched people who I know are cold readers, they don't make any claim to have any psychic powers, but I can be absolutely amazed at how effective they can be. Whereas, I say, your average workaday psychic, the readings are not generally all that impressive. Up until relatively recently, when people had tried to test mediums kind of in a more systematic, controlled way, the results were pretty damned unimpressive. Now, in recent years, there have been some studies that have suggested that maybe sometimes under triple blind conditions, you can't really get much stricter than that, the mediums do perhaps seem to be able to produce answers that are more accurate than one would expect by chance. Now, most of that research has come from one laboratory to date, not all of it, but most of it. And I think, again, it's like another area of, if you'd asked me this a few years ago, I wouldn't have put mediumship as being kind of very high on the list of, well, there may be something in it after all. But it's risen up my rankings because of this recent research. So I will watch that area of research, with interest and see, again, what we ideally want are other independent replications from other laboratories, and then if it looks like there is a real effect there, trying to figure out what that effect might be. I mean, it could be that there's some non-paranormal explanation, but I can't think of one off the top of my head. If it's a paranormal thing, it could either be some form of either clairvoyance or telepathy relating to still living people, or it might provide evidence for life after death. But it's certainly really interesting and intriguing research. And if those results did prove to be reliable and robust and replicable, then that would be a big challenge to the materialistic view of consciousness. I think hypnotic regression is the kind of royal road to false memories. We know that I've written a chapter recently that reviews the whole relationship between hypnosis and false memories, and we know that hypnosis can be used very effectively to implant false memories of lots of different kinds. The same techniques are used whether you are talking about hypnotic regression being used, for example, to recover past life memories, or to recover memories of being abducted by aliens, or to recover memories of being the victim of ritualized satanic abuse. It's the same techniques that are being used. If you examine there's experimental research looking at the use of hypnotic regression, and you can see that it's very obviously related to people's expectations. So if you get people in and say you're going to use hypnotic regression, you're going to take them back into a past life, and if you happen to mention that we found in our previous research that when people are regressed, they're always the same gender as they are in their current life, then that's what you get. If you say, one of the interesting things we've found is that when people are regressed to a past life, they're very often of the opposite gender. Then you will often find that. And basically you can lead people to produce reports that are in line with the expectations that you've just given to them. You get kind of some you typically, with hypnotic past life regression, you get the Hollywood version of life in that particular era, in that particular geographical location, not the historically accurate version. There are a few cases which on the surface appeared to actually check out. And one of the examples I used to always give in my lectures would be the so-called Bloxham tapes. Arnold Bloxham was a hypnotherapist based in Cardiff who would record his sessions, and he had a few participants who appeared to produce not the Hollywood version, but a historically very accurate version of a past life. And this was a real challenge. I remember watching a documentary back in the 1970s, I think it was, by one of our kind of most respected TV presenters presenting these cases. And I was convinced at the time, how could you possibly explain this any other way? Subsequently, people have tried to do so. In particular, one of Bloxham's star subjects was a woman who we call Jane Evans, a Welsh housewife. She had 6 different past life incarnations. Just to take one example, she claimed that in one past life she was the servant girl in the house of a French nobleman, Jacques de Coeur. Now this guy really did exist. She could describe all of his business dealings, not all, but she could describe a lot about his business dealings. She could describe the house that he lived in down to the level of ornaments on the mantelpiece, all sorts of other details about his life that historically checked out. What was a bit weird is that she insisted he was single, whereas the historical record showed quite clearly no, he was married and he had children. So it turns out that there'd been a historical novel written about this guy, and the author had got rid of the family because they just kept getting in the way of the plot. So this fictional version of him didn't have a family, and it looks like, and similarly with other examples, the past life that she was reporting was something she'd read in a historical novel. Now, whether she genuinely had read that novel and then forgotten about it, or whether she was just deliberate, who knows. I would give her the benefit of the doubt. There's a phenomenon called cryptomnesia, literally hidden memories. You can take in information but forget where it came from, and then it comes bubbling up again during the hypnotic regression sessions. So, I mean, even kind of the world's most respected pro-reincarnation researchers, people like Ian Stevenson, rejected hypnotic regression. They didn't think it was a valid technique to look into this. It's often claimed that in cases of alleged past life memories, that certain marks on the body correspond to how that person died in the previous life. So maybe there's a mole here, and that was somebody who was shot through the temple, or maybe there's a rash across the chest, and that's where somebody was run over by a vehicle, or whatever it may be. And people say, well, how can you possibly explain that? Well, I personally think that what is most likely to be going on there is that the marks on the body are what initially is leading people to speculate about who the reincarnation might be. So if you have a child that's born with a big mark across their chest, and you know that somebody in the next village was run over by a truck, then you think, oh, perhaps it's the reincarnation of so-and-so. And then that sets the whole process in flow of asking questions with that assumption, trying to get evidence, trying to, perfectly understandably, if you believe in reincarnation, to say, oh, well, we know that he worked in such and such a shop. Do you have any memories of that shop? So you take them to the shop and they kind of maybe walk in and look around, and initially not much, but eventually a rich false memory can develop, which seems to actually kind of correspond to the marks, but actually it's the marks that have triggered the whole process in the first place, not the other way around. Not all cases, can be explained as easily as that one. I accept that, and again, it's a really intriguing phenomenon. But at the moment, my money would be on an explanation in terms of spontaneous false memories. And by the way, we all have false memories, not usually as interesting and as rich as what these kids are coming up with, but we all have false memories. How might those false memories arise? Well, if you think about a situation where when kids first start talking, they often come out with stuff that doesn't make an awful lot of sense, but we try and make sense of it. In particular, you might get a situation where what would be interpreted in the West as being a kind of an imaginary playmate is actually interpreted as being a genuine memory of somebody that the person might have known in a past life. And in a context where everybody believes in reincarnation, it's quite natural to wonder, oh, well, I wonder who this is. And they'll start to speculate on that. And in this particular society where, Druze were not supposed to intermarry, so it's a very close-knit community anyway. And then on top of that, you've got the past life family links, Whenever anybody died, it would be announced from village to village in the public square and so on and so forth. So there were lots of possible routes. Now, we might start to speculate that maybe, it's so-and-so who was killed in the next village, and then you ask questions, and unintentionally you're producing the false memory. Do you remember the time when you went to blah blah? And the kids taking all this in, and unintentionally a false memory is being created. No, it doesn't. Those kind of things can happen in other culture. It can happen in all kinds of cultures that people can claim that they've got past life memories. Far more common in cultures where there is a widespread belief in reincarnation. Far less common in cultures where they don't, which is pretty much what you'd expect. And that supports either the skeptic's viewpoint or the believer's viewpoint. The believers would say, well, obviously, if a child starts to come up with those kind of statements in a situation where nobody around them believes them, they'll be discouraged from expressing those views and maybe eventually just forget all about it. And that is quite plausible. That's quite possible. But there are lots of other arguments against the general notion of reincarnation. For example, nobody's ever put forward a remotely plausible mechanism for how it could possibly happen. How could it be that memories, attitudes, skills, etc., could be transferred, fears could be transferred from one person into another